Thank you so much, Jamie, and to Senator Scott Ryan, who is here, and Kelly O'Dwyer, many friends. I would not describe John Roscombe as the finest leader of the IPA because his chairman reminded me that he had been the head of the IPA before him. These young Turks, Rod, we've got to keep them under control. There aren't many people around with the longevity or memory of Rod Kemp, but after spending time working with Rod, I can say to you, I share his good sense of humour. To all of you, thank you so much for coming along today. Firstly, I wish to join with many others in offering my congratulations to the Institute for the recent celebration of its 70th birthday. I'm delighted to be here for the first time as both a member of the Institute and as Shadow Treasurer. As we all know, the IPA has had a very long association with the Liberal Party. In fact, it was one of our foundation partners, so I'm honoured to contribute to that long relationship. It is now just a week until the federal budget and 4 months until the federal election. Of course, every budget is important and every election is very important, but I believe this year we really do face some seismic political events. Our responses as a community will determine the sustainability of our prosperity and our way of life for decades to come. We have now had 5 years of a government addicted to a bigger public sector, funded by bigger taxes, big deficits and big debt. That approach, coupled with a government devoid of stability, predictability and honesty, has sapped the resilience of the country. It has weakened our capacity to deal with unexpected shocks, and it has placed us in a much feebler budget position to confront and meet some emerging long-term challenges. Today I want to take a big picture approach. I want to focus on the demographic challenges that are coming into play now and will continue to require policy responses for many decades to come. My address will be in 3 parts. The first part will discuss the impact of an ageing population in China and what it means for economic growth in the world, and particularly here in Australia. The second part will look at the demographic challenge here in Australia and the implications for the budget and for society. And I will conclude by discussing the coalition approach to restoring a sustainable budget strategy and continued long-term economic prosperity. The government has recently rediscovered the importance of Asia for our long-term economic plans. Of course, for political purposes, they still benchmark our economic performance against Europe and America. But the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper, released in October 2012, gives me hope that actually deep down in their hearts they do believe that our economy can be better integrated with Asia. The steps taken by the Prime Minister in recent weeks to strengthen the relationship with China are certainly worthwhile and supported by the coalition. They build on the outstanding work undertaken over many years by other Australian governments, with the possible exception of the Rudd government, which I think did some damage to our relationship with China. These efforts in aggregate reflect themes I discussed in my paper titled Australia's Future Engagement in the Asian Century, delivered at the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club in October 2011, a year before the White Paper. In that paper, I looked at the impact of the rise of Asia's middle class and suggested this was arguably Australia's most significant economic opportunity for growth. Today, I want to explore some issues relating to the ageing of the Chinese population and the challenges and the opportunities that it presents. China is, of course, the world's most populous nation. It is the world's second biggest individual economy, and it is now Australia's most important export destination. China has nearly one fifth of the world's population of 7.1 billion people. However, the growth rate of China's population is quite low, at just under 0.5% a year, ranking it 154th out of 232 countries. This is much lower than our growth of 1.1%. The low population growth is largely, but not only, due to the one-child policy introduced in the 1970s over 3 decades ago. This protracted constraint on the birth rate is now leading to a significant ageing of the Chinese population, with a population structure which more closely matches that of Japan in 1990. There are a number of consequences of this change in the population structure. Firstly, the size of the country's population aged 60 and above is forecast to increase from 200 million in 2015 to over 300 million by 2030. This is occurring while China is still relatively poor on average, with a GDP per head less than 1/5 of the United States. This has led to the observation that China will be the first country to get old before it gets rich. This ageing of the population will change the structure of their economy. There will be a shift in economic emphasis away from investment and production, such as steel production and heavy manufacturing. And there will be a change in consumption patterns, including increased demand for healthcare, aged care services, and income support. As an example of the impact of likely changes in consumption patterns, we can look to Japan, which is further down the demographic road than China. Nothing could reflect the change more obviously than reports from Japan that in 2011, sales of adult nappies exceeded those of babies for the first time. In China, the national dependency ratio will rise with an increased number of older people per worker. So there will be a declining number of workers to supply the resources needed to fund the rising cost of health and aged care. These pressures will be exacerbated by the growing numbers of families with just one child. And indeed, there'll be a vast number of elderly Chinese with no surviving children. With less or no family support, there will be increasing numbers of elderly Chinese, relying entirely on the state for survival. And you can think through the politics of that domestically. Second, sometime in the next 10 to 15 years, the total population of China will peak and begin to decline. China will lose its long-held position as the world's most populous country to India. This is of concern because economic growth is in the long run a product of 3 factors: population growth, participation, and productivity. In China, the first 2 factors will turn negative. The population will begin to fall and the participation rate will decline as the population ages. This will make China totally reliant on improvements in productivity to generate increases in economic growth per capita and to increase the average standard of living of its people. For example, this means that they need better, more accessible technology to improve their innovation. The urgency of this task should not be underestimated. To maintain rates of economic growth around current levels, China will need to increase its pace of productivity growth sooner rather than later. Basically, it needs to speed up its tooling of its people, its innovation. It needs to move quickly and now. And so there must be an air of desperation in the movement of the central government to try and empower the people to get on with the job of improving productivity growth. Third, the supply of new workers will begin to taper away. China's economic miracle of the past 2 decades or so has relied on a rapid expansion of a young and productive labour force. Now, this has been the product of previously higher birth rates and the influx of workers from regional to urban areas. Huge change. It's estimated that up to 1/4 of China's economic growth between 1980 and 2000 was the result of this rapid expansion of the urban workforce. Now, Sir William Lewis, who died in the early 1990s, he left a legacy that described this. It's known as the Lewis turning point. And there's some debate amongst economists about when that kicks in. The point where people moving from subsistence lifestyles coming into the urban cities and they fill the demand for labour. But when there is no more labour coming in, then you see wages start to rise, and that represents a challenge for a developing economy. The sobering news is that this demographic phenomenon has peaked, and the days of abundant, inexpensive labour are in the past. It is estimated that the reversal of this demographic dividend will reduce the economic growth rate by at least 0.5 percentage point per year. So China is not alone in experiencing significant demographic challenges. Indeed, these challenges are not dissimilar and are happening in Japan, obviously, but also South Korea and Singapore, with the number of older people leaving the workforce now matching or exceeding the number of young people entering it. However, the changes in China will have global implications because of the speed and sheer numbers of people involved and what that means for China as a producer and consumer of goods. China has become the default producer of cheap, mass-produced goods for the world, and that has contributed to the decline of manufacturing industries in many developed countries, including Australia. But it's helped to reduce global inflationary pressures as production has switched from high-cost to low-cost countries and low-cost centres. It's also helped to raise global living standards by reducing the relative price of manufactured goods. These trends are now beginning to reverse. Reports from China suggest the shortage of labour is now beginning to impact on wages. The Ministry of Commerce estimates that wages have risen by 33% in the last 3 years. And it's not happening accidentally. The Communist Party National Congress in November 2012 said it wanted wages for lowly paid workers to double by 2020. And China's State Council has set a goal of raising the minimum wage by 13% a year for the next 3 years. And of course, China is no longer necessarily a number of firms identifying that they are moving their operations to less expensive countries, such as Vietnam, and, believe it or not, the United States. As one Australian manufacturer said to me the other day, he said he's moving his manufacturing operations from China to the United States. And I believe him. So if you look at what it means, back in 2001, China's share of the global production of shoes was 40% and Vietnam was 13%. 9 years later, Vietnam overtook China in the production of shoes. In recent years, Adidas has closed its only factory in China to relocate to Myanmar, and Nike closed its only plant in China in 2009. So they're losing manufacturing jobs as well. This increase in the cost of doing business will mean the deflationary global pulse from the rise of China will certainly lose its force and may well begin to unwind. Global inflation is low at present due to very low capacity utilisation of capital and large quantities of surplus labour in many developed countries, most obviously Europe, Spain, where you've got 27% unemployment, for example. But the developments in China, combined with massive global liquidity injections from developed country central banks, suggest it would be a brave man who would bet on inflation remaining at current low levels. Therefore, the demographic developments in China have particular relevance to us in Australia. China is now the largest recipient of our exports, and it has been a huge influence on the rise of our terms of trade to record levels. These two influences, increased quantities of exports and higher prices for those exports, have delivered massive income gains for our country. They have also led to the biggest mining investment boom in our history, with a concomitant boost to Australia's economic growth. And they have contributed to the high Australian dollar, which has spread the benefits of the boom to all Australians through lower prices of imported goods and services. And I might add, you don't need to have a Labor government to redistribute wealth, because in a sense, having that low inflation, a stronger Australian dollar, has meant that the market is doing its job. These positive influences are likely to wane China's demand for heavy resources will ease as the economy reduces its reliance on investment and production and switches more towards services, and as it becomes less dominant as the world's producer of cheap manufactured goods. We may well have already seen the peak in our terms of trade, and the Reserve Bank has suggested we are close to the peak in resource investment. These developments mean our economy will need to transition to alternative sources of growth. The non-mining sectors, including services, will need to and have to pick up the slack. Australian two-way trade with China was worth $127 billion last year. Exports of goods and services comprised about $83 billion of this. China is already our largest export partner for services as well, not just iron ore and other things, services, it's our biggest market. Although the money is much less than the export of goods. Services was just $5.7 billion of the $127 billion. And nearly 90% of this was travel for both business and leisure. Clearly, there is massive untapped upside in education services, accounting services, legal services, financial services and health services exports to China. So we are actually seeing the tip of the iceberg and the opportunity. I should point out that growth in trade between China and Australia has not just done us some great benefit, it's also benefited China massively by facilitating rapid economic development and, importantly, in defence of capitalism, seeing the greatest poverty alleviation program in the history of the world. And there is a crucial point to be made here that's often not well understood. If people are really concerned about improving the lives of people in developing countries, then pursuing free trade in goods and services and the free flow of capital will do more to provide economic growth, jobs and a sustainable increase in the standard of living than any amount of foreign aid. And as I pointed out in my address of October 2011, Australia must diversify its relationship with China to capitalise on the growth of China's middle class, their rising affluence and their taste for higher priced and higher quality services. There is enormous untapped potential for increased inbound tourism from China, enhanced education links, with us becoming an education hub, and for Australia to be a high-quality healthcare centre for the region. Financial services is also an area where Australia can sell its knowledge and expertise. We should be satisfying the increasingly affluent China middle-class demand for savings and investment products and advice, and providing ageing Chinese with funds management and retirement planning services. The changing Chinese demographics will also have impact on our national income, with reduced income flows from offshore and slower growth in nominal GDP, unless the income lost from the end of the mining boom can be replaced. That raises all sorts of issues for company profitability and government tax receipts. If this Treasurer thinks it's difficult to balance the budget now, it could get even harder as time goes on. But I'm a glass half full kind of guy, right? I prefer to view these demographic changes in China as providing massive opportunities for us. In Australia, we also need to consider the challenges arising from the ageing of our own population. The 2010 Intergenerational Report is very sober reading. In fact, I keep it on my desk in Parliament House. It's no surprise that our population is ageing as the baby boomer generation bulge moves through the system. The proportion of people aged 65 years or over is going to increase from 13% of our population to 23% by 2050. The report, population ageing will mean there are fewer workers to support retirees and young dependents. That's why I had 3 children. Wasn't just Peter Costello's baby bonus, I can tell you. The report states that the number of traditional working age people to support each retiree is expected to fall from 5 today to 2.7 in 2050. In 1970, the ratio was 3 times higher, with 7.5 working age people for each person aged over 65. At the same time, the ageing population will result in substantial fiscal pressures from increased demand for increased spending on health, age-related pensions and aged care. So putting some numbers around this, health expenditure is expected to nearly double as a percentage of GDP over the next 40 years. And the great bulk of that is being picked up by the states, which we can talk about a little later. Australian government spending on aged care is projected to increase as a proportion of GDP from just under 1% in 2010 to just under 2%, so nearly doubling by 2050. And spending on age-related pension payments are projected to increase from 2.7% of GDP to nearly 4% by 2050. The report notes that if steps are not taken to close the fiscal gap, over time the budget would be in deficit by 3.75% of GDP and net debt would grow to around 20% of GDP. Today's numbers, the 3.75% would be roughly around $55–60 billion deficit. And that's the structural starting point before Wayne Swan gets to it. So what do? The first thing is we should be restoring the sustainability of the budget and stabilising and reducing Labor's ever-rising debt as quickly as possible. The demographic pressures will only intensify over time. So if we can't get control of the budget now, we never will. And we should do that by attacking spending, looking for structural saves that will deliver long-term benefits. I believe that this will involve some resetting of the national mindset on the role of government. As I noted in my speech, which John talked about, just over a year ago in London, I believe the end of the age of entitlement must come. And all developed countries, in particular, must realise that you cannot continue to fund a lifestyle which is beyond your means. Addressing the ongoing fiscal crises will involve the winding back of universal access to payments and entitlements from the state. This will require the redefining of the concept of mutual obligation and the reinvigoration of a culture of self-reliance. We need to get back to the days where people accept some personal responsibility for their actions. The Coalition has already announced that should it win government, it will put in place a commission of audit to go through the government accounts line by line to identify genuine savings. This commission will be guided by three key principles. First, governments should do for people what they can't do for themselves and no more. Second, governments should have respect for taxpayers. And third, government should live within its means. They're basic principles. The Audit Commission will prepare a report for the government on changes which are required in the delivery of government programs and in the process of government to ensure that Commonwealth government activities satisfy these three principles in a manner which minimises the call on taxpayer resources. The Coalition, and Tony Abbott in particular, have already shown we're very serious about this, saying that we will have to end the school kids bonus should we be re-elected or be elected. That is a $1.2 billion a year payment to families, which was funded by the mining tax. Well, there is no mining tax, and it's borrowed money, and we cannot afford it, and it's going to go. And I believe the Australian public understand that. They understand it, they truly do. And they accept that we can no longer afford a government that continues to spend money it doesn't have. And they also know that when the government borrows money, they're borrowing tomorrow's taxpayers' money. So it's no good to talk about just tax as a percentage of GDP. You have to add the borrowings in there because you are borrowing future taxes to spend today. The Coalition will need to see the state of the budget and the pre-election fiscal and economic and fiscal outlook before it can finalise all its details on spending commitments and savings commitments. That document is hugely important. It is the only... I'm sure you can work it out. As such, we believe that PFO is most likely not to be influenced by political considerations. The Coalition has copped some criticism for not releasing its suite of policies earlier. But in response, I note that in the last two elections, 2007 and 2010, The Labor Party released its final overall costings on the afternoon of the Friday before the election. I can assure you we'll do better than that. The second action will be to put in place policies which make people financially independent so that they can rely on their own resources rather than the state for the income and services they need. In this light, the Labor Party's, the government's recent attacks and $8 billion tax grab on superannuation seems counterproductive, boosting budget revenue in the short term but compromising the self-sufficiency of an ageing population over the long term. It's been a crazy debate and we will not proceed with it. In this context, the Coalition took the deliberate decision to retain the increase in compulsory super from 9 to 12 that was part of the MRRT package, even though we will be abolishing the tax and other associated spending measures. And we've committed to making no unexpected negative changes to superannuation should we be fortunate enough to win office in the coming election. And the third action we need to take is to grow the economy as quickly as possible so as to maximise the empowerment of individuals, and it will improve government revenue. And the key there will be improvements in participation and productivity. The intergenerational report notes that productivity will be the key driver of economic growth in the future. It says productivity growth is projected to be the major contributor to increases in living standards over the next 40 years. We agree that productivity is the key to continued prosperity. Tony Abbott and I have a 6-point plan that the Coalition has put forward to improve productivity. First, there will be genuine welfare reform to lift participation in work. As an example of what can be done, I refer you to our policies at the last election to improve outcomes for mature and long-term young employed Australians. Now, I know the Coalition policy on paid parental leave has been a source of discussion recently, but I'd say to you, the boost in the retention of working mothers in the labour force is going to improve participation, which will drive productivity growth. Second, there will be reform of the public sector to improve the efficiency of its operations and ensure it's providing the services which only government can provide and no more. Third, we will slash $1 billion of red and green tape to reduce business regulatory costs. And as an example of that, we'll revisit FOFA, the Future of Financial Advice reforms, to remove costly duplication and red tape that has been imposed on the entire financial services industry. Fourth, we'll review competition policy to ensure that large and small businesses are competing on a genuinely level playing field. Fifth, we'll ensure Commonwealth spending on infrastructure provides value for money. We will have cost-benefit analyses rather than rely on the wisdom of Anthony Albanese. And the sixth initiative we'll look at are incremental improvements to labour market regulation within the framework of the Fair Work Act. And we'll have more to say about that in the not-too-distant future. Finally, I should add that the Coalition cannot expect productivity growth in Australia to improve if the public sector itself uses obsolete technology and antiquated processes for the delivery of payments and services to the general public. Roughly 10% of GDP is delivered through Centrelink, Medicare, and a handful of government agencies. Yet the procedures and rules used for customer interaction remain mired in 20th century technology. The Coalition will be looking to improve the engagement mechanisms with its customer base so that interaction with the Commonwealth is as easy and seamless as it is with many private sector customer-focused businesses. Ladies and gentlemen, over the coming decades, Australia will face some big picture challenges from the ageing of the population, not just here, but abroad as well. And these challenges can only be successfully met with policies that grow the economy as quickly as possible and which limit the call on government resources, that's your resources, taxpayer resources, to those that really need it. Little time is left for the preparation work to be undertaken. It will require leadership supported by a steely resolve and community engagement. As you would expect, the IPA has an important role to play in highlighting the challenges and prosecuting the case for reform. As both a policy spine stiffener and as an advocate for free markets, I welcome your encouragement and your engagement. And I also occasionally welcome the tick-off or the criticism. I don't want to encourage the criticism too much, but ladies and gentlemen, there's much work to be done, but the Coalition is ready for the challenge. Thank you very much.